Welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, available on Pacifica Radio and Progressive Radio Networks and iHeartRadio and iTunes and Stitcher and SoundCloud and at opednews.com/podcasts. My guest for this show is a return guest who I'm really thrilled to have back. She is Riane Eisler, President of the Center for Partnership Studies, Editor-in-Chief of the Interdisciplinary Journal of Partnership Studies. She's internationally known as a systems scientist, cultural historian, and a pioneering attorney working for women's and children's human rights. Working for women's and children's human rights. Her groundbreaking books include The Chalice and the Blade, Tomorrow's Children, Real Wealth of Nations, and she's co-author of a new book, Nurturing Our Humanity, How Domination and Partnership Shape Our Brains, Lives, and Future. Her website is rianeeisler.com, RianeEisler.com. So great to have you back on the show.
It's wonderful to be with you again.
Yeah, and you have outdone yourself. This is a great book. Now, you actually co-authored this book. This one you co-authored with Douglas Fry. And right. It's just, you keep hitting him out of the ballpark. You write amazing books, and this is just, I'm very excited about it. It's really addresses problems that we have, systemic, chronic, long-term problems, and comes up with solutions and answers that are very different than most people think about and very different than most progressives approach things with, since most of my most of my listeners are progressives. So what I want to start, though, is you're famous because you wrote a classic book that it was reprinted after 25 years and more, The Chalice and the Blade. So give us like a couple minutes to just tell us that history, that book. What was the story of that? And then we'll jump into the new book.
Well, The Chalice and the Blade actually never went out of print. It is now in its 57th U.S. printing.
Wow.
And, yeah, it's in almost 30 foreign editions. And I want to say something. For the 30th anniversary, HarperCollins asked me to write a new epilogue. So I urge people to get the latest copy, the latest edition, because that epilogue brings it up to date all the way to now, to Trump, etc. And what can I tell you about the book? It was the first book for a popular audience with a mainstream house to really report the findings from my multidisciplinary cross-cultural research, which, as you alluded to, is very different, isn't it?
Yes.
Most studies of society, in that it draws from a database that includes the whole of humanity, both its female and its male halves, the whole of our lives, not just where most studies focus on politics, economics, religion, etc., but where we all live, in our family and other intimate relations, which this new book, by the way, really highlights in the light of findings from neuroscience. And also, and this is really, I think, what the story from the books that changed so many lives, it draws from the whole of our history, including that span of millennia before recorded history that we call prehistory, showing that if we look at society through a new lens, the lens of what I call the partnership-domination social scale, we can actually see that, first of all, the original direction of our cultural evolution was more in a partnership rather than domination direction. And secondly, and this is most important for us today, that for the past several centuries, during the upheavals of the Industrial Revolution, which really, lasted for centuries, actually, we have been moving more again towards the partnership side. So that the struggle for our future is not between capitalist and socialist, right and left, religious, secular. You've had horrible regimes in all these categories. The struggle really is between a partnership and domination configuration, social configuration, within all of these different kinds of societies.
The one thing that I want to get, though, is the title of the book was The Chalice and the Blade. And that basically, the chalice and the blade represents the idea of partnership or domination. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. So let's move into the new book. The new book is Nurturing Our Humanity, How Domination and Partnership Shape Our Brains, Lives, and Future.
Yes, and that book really combines my new approach to the study of human societies, human relations, as well as our relations with nature, of course, with two new elements. One, my co-author's findings, and he's probably the world's leading authority on this, on foraging societies, disproving really that story that we have been told, and we keep being told, that, oh, well, too bad that we have war and rape and terrorism and, all of these things. It's just part of human nature, of evolutionary imperatives that developed during our prehistory and protohistory. Well, it absolutely is not true, because foraging societies were, what Douglas Fry, my co-author, calls the original partnership societies. More peaceful, more gender balanced, more generally egalitarian, and far, far more peaceful.
And what's wonderful about the book is you really get into exploring how humanity shifted, the transition, going back to before civilization, because you talk about how there's a nomadic forager and then a complex forager, and that apparently was the key shift. And I love how you're tying all this in with war, too. That is a fascinating element of it. And before we go any further, I just want to say, you mentioned that there's a coupon or a discount available that people can...
Yes, there is a discount.
Why don't you tell us about that?
And if you go to the Oxford University Press website, because the book is coming out with Oxford University Press, you can get a 30% discount on the book.
Oh, if they buy it directly from the publisher.
Buy it directly from the publisher.
There you go. Cut Amazon out. Nice. Or go to a local bookstore.
Or go to a local bookstore. They are really a threatened species.
Yes.
I really want to support them. But let me add something, if I may, which is that the other element, and this is huge, that this book brings to bear are the findings we today have from neuroscience, from the biological sciences, which show, again, contrary to either the story of original sin or of selfish genes, because why they fight each other it's the same story, isn't it? We're bad, we have to be controlled from the top, right? That contrary to that story, actually the default for humans, as you alluded to, was really more towards a partnership direction. Not ideal, of course, but sharing, caring, being conscious, being creative rather than destructive and cruel. But the book shows how our brains do not develop in isolation from our environments. In fact, the real issue is gene expression. And
epigenetics. Epigenetics
is part of the story that we tell. But the gene expression, for example, we show that some men have a gene that actually has been shown to predispose them to violence. But not every man with this gene is violent, only those that really have what we call adverse childhood experiences. And what this really brings to bear is that most studies of society, like most social categories, ignore the majority of humanity women and children. And childhood relations, gender relations are fundamental to having the really foundations, bringing them towards partnership rather than domination.
Okay, so let's take a step back, because we really haven't described what partnership and domination are in your terms. So why don't you give us a quick overview of those two concepts?
Well, we are not used to thinking of childhood and gender when we think of society. And I really have to start with that because it's fascinating. Of all of the thousand, it's over 1,000 years of so-called modern science, right? But it's only in the last 50 years that women's studies, men's studies, gender studies, queer studies even began to enter the academy, and they're still completely marginalized. As for the study of child development, in light of what we today know from not only psychology and neuroscience, that's completely left out of sociology courses, political science courses, cultural courses. It has to be part of it because we now know from neuroscience that what children experience and observe early on impacts nothing less than how our brains develop. So the partnership and domination systems take these relations into account.
But wait, I need you to explain what a partnership system is and a domination system is. Start with that so people are clear.
Social configuration that is ignored really in most studies. In a domination system, first of all, and I'm going to just talk about the salient part of the configuration because everything is different. In a domination society, you have top-down rankings, not only in the state or tribe, but in the family. Secondly, in gender relations, whether it's Hitler's Germany or Khomeini's Iran or ISIS, secular, religious, Eastern, Western, or the so-called rightist fundamentalist alliance here in the United States, for them a top priority is always returning to a, quote, traditional family, which is code for an authoritarian, rigidly male-dominated, highly punitive family. Always. In a partnership system, you have more gender equity, and with this, you don't have this gendered system of values that you have in domination systems, where anything considered, quote, soft or feminine, like caring, caregiving, nonviolence, is, devalued. And third, you have less violence in partnership societies. It doesn't have to be built into the system to maintain these rankings of man over man, man over woman, race over race, religion over
religion. And you literally say in the book that violence is institutionalized and fear and force are used to maintain domination in that kind of a culture.
Absolutely, which doesn't mean that there's never any violence in a partnership system, but it doesn't have to be institutionalized. And fourth, of course, are stories and the narratives that we are taught are the truth, the ultimate truth about humanity, in particular about human nature. Very different in each system. In domination systems, we have inherited all of these narratives, whether they're religious or scientific or whatever, about human nature being flawed, right? We need to be controlled. And whereas in partnership systems, certainly the narratives recognize that we humans can be cruel and we can be violent, but they also recognize that what makes us truly human are our capacities for consciousness, for caring, for creativity. And that this is actually, quote, normal in a partnership society which supports the gene expression of these capacities.
And along those lines, you also write that in the domination system, there's a belief that rankings of domination are divinely or naturally ordained, which makes it tough because it's part of a religion.
It makes it very tough. But as I write in this new book, which, by the way, I've been working on for 10 years. And 3 years ago, I invited Doug to be my co-author because, as I said, he brings such a wonderful, important piece to it. But the thing that's so fascinating to me about the narratives that we've been told is that they're really, oh my gosh.
We had a little accidental interruption there, but we're back. And what I love about what you bring to this book is the discussion of pre-civilization, pre-agrarian times. Now, you've already talked about hunter-gatherers, and just to kind of summarize a little bit, what I get from it is that people were much more in a partnership mode. Now, I call the show The Bottom Up Show, and I've written a book, The Bottom Up Revolution, and I think that much of what you describe as partnership is really, in my language, bottom-up ways of relating to each other. The parenting, the raising of children, the relationship between each other, the consideration, the caring, the cooperation, the interdependence. To me, those are all bottom-up concepts. And so I love this whole book because, to me, it is talking that language. And one of the things that I've kind of believed, and that part of it I got from you because of Chalice and the Blade, is this idea that civilization brought with it this domination. Civilization brought with it hard power and hard control. And what you're doing in this book is providing research that literally shows us that these archaeological and anthropological digs and findings show us that, yes, humans were partners, not dominators, for most of their existence. So talk a bit about some of that information that you have that you bring to the table on that.
That is fundamental because if you recall stories, narratives, we humans live by stories. And the story that we're told, remember that Caveman Cartoon that we show children before their brains, not to speak of their critical faculties, are formed. In one hand, he's got a weapon, right, a club, and with another, he's dragging a woman by the hair. So what's the message? Before children can even think critically at all, it's that violence, male dominance, that's how it's always been, and by implication, that's how it always has to be. And the evidence is absolutely against this. Now, I want to say that there are some nuances. When you say civilization brought this, there are many theories about what happened. One theory, of course, is that it was the shift to more complex societies. Another theory, which was advanced by the archaeologist Maria Gimbutas, which is now actually being confirmed by some DNA studies, which I'll get to in a minute, is that it was brought in by nomadic pastoralists in Europe by the so-called Kurgans or Indo-Europeans. But certainly we begin to see that with more complex societies, whatever the reason, you do have more of these rankings of domination. However, and I think this goes back to the Chalice and the Blade already, the agrarian societies such as Çatalhöyük, no war, no signs of destruction through war for over 1,000 years, as the archaeologist Ian Harder writes, no signs that being born male or female had any impact on a person's status or quality of life. and much more egalitarian. And the civilization of Minoan Crete, which also we mention, of course, both of these in this new book, again, was quite centralized, quite, quote, high civilization, and yet was not yet a domination system. So I'm not an either environmental or technological determinist. And
Okay.
I think that it's important that we not think that just because we have more complexity, we have to have domination, because look at the Scandinavian nations, the Nordic nations, they're quite complex, but they're more partnership oriented.
Yes. So what was the difference? What makes a complex society partnership oriented or domination oriented?
Well,
I guess that's what your book is all about here.
beg your pardon?
That's what the book is all about.
Well, not really. No, the book is primarily about the effects on the brain, and therefore on how we feel, how we think, how we act, including how we vote, of either a domination or a partnership environment, because our human brain is so very flexible. And, it brings in, for example, that the evolution of love, which is ignored in most evolutionary analysis, was actually central to the emergence of our species, because we have such a long period of complete helplessness, don't we?
Yes, we do.
The time during which our brains really develop in interaction with our environment, and without caring, without some degree of love, we don't survive, and we certainly don't thrive.
And empathy, you've got to throw empathy in there too.
Well, empathy is part of love.
Okay, go ahead. Talk a little bit more about the neuroscience and evolutionary elements of love. Give us some more. That's fascinating.
This book introduces a new approach to what it was that made humans human. How did we evolve? And contrary to your standard evolutionary analysis, it shows that the evolution of caring, of love, which has a long evolutionary history, mammals, then birds as well as mammals, and then there's a quantum leap with humans.
Franz de Waal told me that it started with lactation, and that required empathy. And that goes back, he told me, 200 million years.
Yes, that's right. But with humans, you also see, as I said, this quantum leap, because our species has this very long period of absolute helplessness after we're born. And people don't really realize, and this should be taught in universities, that a baby is not born with a fully developed brain. Quite the contrary. Our brains develop in interaction with our environments. The first 20 years, it is really high-level development, but it can also change the brain all through our lives, which I think is something that we have to understand. Now, it's true that people who have grown up in very rigid domination environments, their brains are affected. Remember, I don't know if you read that part of the book about, we've long known, for example, that people who score high in the F for fascist scale, in other words, people who come from families typically where they're very domination oriented, where you have to love the person who causes you pain, okay? That's just required.
You talk about that. You talk about how that's one of the things that kind of potentiates, where is it? That there's this kind of a pain and love combination that leads to domination.
It's the confluence of caring and coercion.
That's, yeah. I couldn't find it in my 3 pages of notes there, but I wrote it down.
Well, this book,
Coercion and caring.
yes. And that's exactly what children experience in domination families. And they not only experience it, but they observe this ranking really of one type of human being over another, male over female, because that's typical of domination systems, rightist, leftist, eastern, western, northern, southern, it doesn't really matter. So very early, the structure of the brain adapts. And one of the most interesting studies in that connection is how the people who are brought up in these environments, have such a difficult time adjusting, adapting to change. And one study showed that actually the part of the brain that helps us deal with change is different in these kinds of people who consider themselves, quote, very conservative.
I was fascinated. There was one study you cited where people were presented with either an M or a W, and they would get I think the M 4 times as much as the W, and conservatives, and then they had to click a button for which one, and conservatives were much more likely to get it wrong, to get stuck on the one that they got the most of. And so it's a neurobiological thing. This inability to be flexible is the way you talk about it.
Well, and the psychologist Elsa Frankel-Brunswick already observed this long before these brain scans, these types of experiments. She observed that where people were who, as I said, scored high on the F for fascist scale, who consider themselves, quote, very conservative, these people had a hard time when a picture of a dog slowly started to turn into a cat. They just stuck to that dog. And what she pointed out is almost as if there is a voice of authority in their heads that, the initial statement, they're stuck. It is, but we don't have to be. And
okay, so we don't have to be, and we need to take a break now. And there'll be we'll pop in a bumper and do a station ID. We're going to pause for 10 seconds so we can find it and do the editing, and then we'll come back because, okay, we'll do the pause. And you're listening to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show. My guest for this show is Riane Eisler. She is the author of a new book. In addition to her classic book, The Chalice and the Blade, she's got a new book out, Nurturing Our Humanity, How Domination and Partnership Shape Our Brains, Lives, and Future. Her website is rianeeisler.com. So a good chunk of this book is about how do you fix this? How do you change things? I want to make sure we cover it because I've got all these pages and notes, and you basically say there are 4 cornerstones of partnership. The way we've got this problem, which is too much domination, which we'll get into a little bit more, but the answer is partnership is the alternative to domination. And so I want to kind of jump to the end in a sense and cover that because I want to make sure that everybody hears it. And you break it down into 4 parts, and those 4 parts are what?
Childhood, gender, economics, but from a very different perspective, and narratives, stories, language. Okay. Language is very important, by the way, because we linguistic psychologists have long told us that the categories, and especially social categories, provided by a language channel our thinking. So as Einstein said, we can't solve problems with the same thinking that created them. We need new language. And my work has introduced quite a bit of this new language, not only the partnership and domination systems, but hierarchies of actualization rather than hierarchies of domination, and so on.
Okay, so let's talk about it. So, but you've got the four different elements. So talk about childhood and what we need to deal with there. Now, you've already talked about how people's brains end up developing differently because children's brains are not fully formed, and how their environment affects how they are raised and how their brains end up working. Now, I've had on a number of times Darsha Narvaez. She wrote the book, The Neurobiology of the Development of Human Morality, and she's got a book with 1,500 different studies discussing how there are hundreds of genes that all affect how we become moral human beings. And her big thing is it's all about how we raise our children. So what are some of the elements that we need to change?
And I should add that I have actually know Darcia and contributed a piece to one of her books.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Well, what's beginning to happen, and this is really very important, that within the rather ossified and siloed academic establishment, we're seeing some change. And that's very important. And I urge our listeners to really get this book into the academy, because Oxford University Press, obviously, is a very reputable scholarly publication, and we have to change. We're moving a little bit towards a more interdisciplinary approach, but it's still so completely fragmenting. So, childhood. A good part of nurturing our humanity deals with precisely what the subtitle says, how domination and partnership shape our brains, lives, and future. And I think that a very interesting way of getting there is voting behavior in adults. Because what I started to talk about is how children in domination families, where caring and coercion are sort of, part and parcel of each other, they're totally dependent, okay, on the adults who are caring for them. And so they have to love these adults. And what the evidence now shows is that they're very predisposed to love a bully.
Well, what's interesting is and somebody else who has written about this is George Lakoff. He wrote a whole book about this moral politics kind of a way of thinking, where conservatives have a strict father, family, and upbringing, and liberals have a kind of a nurturing, supportive family. And I think it fits in perfectly with the model you're describing.
Absolutely. And of course, I deal with that in my book on economics, The Real Wealth of Nations, in great detail, showing how our present economic systems, whether they're capitalist or socialist, have been driven by this notion that the soft, the feminine, is devalued. Caring for people, caring for nature is not included. But I'm jumping to economics. Let's stay with childhood for a minute. They're all interconnected, and I think that one of the things that we must teach in our universities is systems literacy.
I love systems theory. Go ahead.
Yeah, because and I was exposed, as you may recall, to systems theory and to systems analysis very early in my multiple career when I was a social scientist at an offshoot of the Rand Corporation, before I went back to law school and before I embarked on my multidisciplinary work. So from the get-go, I was looking at the whole system.
Why are systems important? Why is it important to think about them?
Well, if you don't look at the whole of a picture, if you just look at one part and then another part and another part, like right-left or religious-secular or Eastern-Western and so on, A colleague of mine has called these categories weapons of mass distraction. They fragment our consciousness. We can't connect the dots. We're not seeing major dots, which takes us right back to childhood.
And a non-systemic approach, a more linear approach, I think it enables people to be programmed in an authoritarian kind of a model, because they don't look at the big picture. They don't look at how everything is connected to everything else, because systems theory is all about patterns and relationships rather than parts and elements, which is the way people in science even process things for hundreds of years until just the last 40 or 50 years.
Yeah. Well, and the historian of science, David Noble, pointed out that so-called modern science came out of a celibate, clerical, largely misogynist, medieval culture, what he calls a world without women. And it was not only a world without women, but a world without children. And science reflects this, and we have to change it.
Wow, that's even worse than I thought. Oh, but yes, it's true. Ouch. So and it is changing. That's the good news. Modern science has moved towards systems theory because it's the only kind of science that explains things like complex environments and subatomic particle physics and the like.
Well, human societies, human beings really are complex systems.
Yes. So you were talking about children and you got into systems theory. Keep going.
Well, the obvious, which we know from psychology, is that what children experience and observe has a profound influence on the kinds of people they grow up to be. And now neuroscience, of course, is really providing the, quote, hard science. And people, you mentioned epigenetics earlier, which is fascinating, the findings that actually we are influenced by experiences that our parents and grandparents had. I mean, that this has been experimentally proven, well, with fruit flies, but there was a very famous study, which is in Nurturing Our Humanity, about what happened to people who were born in Holland during the Great Famine that was imposed by the Nazis there. And fascinating. We really have to begin to look at the whole picture. And back to childhood. It is not coincidental, as I said, and this bears repeating, that these repressive, violent societies, whether it's Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Soviet Union or Khomeini's Iran or ISIS or the so-called rightist fundamentalist alliance in the United States, a would-be theocratic regime, always have a top priority of reimposing or maintaining this, quote, traditional code word for authoritarian, male-dominated, punitive, highly punitive family, because it's foundational. So we have to change that foundation to a partnership family, where child rearing is not authoritarian, but authoritative. Yeah, children do need limits. Children do need guidelines. That's why I make a distinction between hierarchies of actualization, where power is not power over, but power to and power with. And accountability, respect, benefits don't just flow from the bottom up, but both ways. I mean, the whole idea that the answer is just cooperation is crazy, because think about it, all kinds of domination, cartels cooperate, gangs cooperate, invading armies cooperate. You can have cooperation, and you do have cooperation in domination systems as well. It is this contrasting configuration. And people who really are understanding this configuration, their whole life changes. I mean, I get so much mail from people saying that my work has really empowered them and changed their lives.
I love the concept of that idea of the hierarchies of empowerment and enabling. That whole concept is wonderful. And I think, you know, I've tried to, in my thinking about bottom up, thinking about a different kind of success. You know, most people, I think of success as money and power and having a lot of things, which is what our consumer culture teaches us. But I think what you're describing is a hierarchy where if you do more good, if you help more people, then you are higher on the hierarchy. And to me, I mean, it's kind of a Buddhist thing, kind of like a bodhisattva, somebody who is a Buddhist saint who does good for the world and helps people, really, which is such a beautiful vision.
And it's a reality because we have, and these experiments are reported in Nurturing Our Humanity, the pleasure centers of our brains light up more when we share than when we win. People receive more happiness when they give. I mean, we know this, but look, if you are brought up in a rigid domination system to survive, you have to adapt. And that's why this authoritarian family with the very rigid gender stereotypes, you know, where caregiving, the feminine is devalued, is fundamental to domination systems. And progressives have not understood this. You know, regressives get it in their gut. You know, that's a priority. For progressives, these are very often just women's and children's issues. They are fundamental. And that is really what we need to understand if in the longer term we are to avoid these terrible regressions like the one we're living through right now.
So let's go back to the Four Cornerstones. And the first one is children. The second one is gender, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Let's talk a little bit about the gender one.
Well, it's so amazing when you really think about it, because how do we socialize children, boys and girls? It's for gender roles and relations, isn't it?
Yes.
That's fundamental to our very sense of identity as humans. So, for example, in the Nordic nations, Sweden, Finland, Norway, you really don't have such rigid gender stereotypes. They're more partnership oriented. So what happens, and women are, of course, 50% of the national legislature. So what happens is that as the status of women rises, men no longer feel it's such a threat to their status, their quote, masculinity, which today we talk toxic masculinity, right? The old domination masculinity. They can embrace and vote for caring policies. So it's not coincidental that these nations, for example, introduced universal health care, very much government support for early childhood education, very generous paid parental leave for both mothers and fathers. And it's also not coincidental that they care more for our planet.
Well, another piece that you talk about in the book is punishment. You know, yes. I want to just throw back, you use the phrase confluence of caring with coercion and pain. That's the dominator model. And you talk about in the book about how the first country banned hitting children, I think in 1969.
Sweden.
And was Sweden?
Yes, Sweden.
And since then, dozens of countries have made it illegal to hit children to punish them.
And this is a very, very important thing. And if our listeners back one thing, just recently, the American Psychological Association finally came out and said not only is spanking ineffective, but it is harmful. So agitate for laws worldwide that make using physical discipline in families against the law, because this is very, very important. We have studies showing that a majority of people today still think that hitting children is okay, which is crazy, because if you hit an adult, it's a crime. But if you hit a child who's helpless and who's dependent on you, it's not a crime? I mean, hey, there's
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
wrong how we've been taught to think.
So I want to kind of just, you've got a kind of a chart in the book that goes through the four cornerstones. And because we've only got a limited amount of time, I want to kind of rip through that and kind of go over that briefly with you, if you don't mind. Okay. So for childhood, it's delegitimize violence against children as immoral and dysfunctional, unite behind campaigns to end violence and abuse of children worldwide, promote caring, authoritative rather than authoritarian parenting that empowers rather than disempowers. Ensure health care and good nutrition for all children. Show the personal, economic, social, and environmental benefits from these policies. Support and improve public education and promote environmentally conscious, gender-balanced, multicultural education to help young people learn to respect themselves, others, and the environment, and to co-create a healthy, equitable future and provide high-quality child care and caregiver training. Then you go to gender, and I'm going to just, it's okay? I rip through this like this?
Absolutely.
Change cultural beliefs that the male half of humanity is entitled to control the female half of families and societies. Unlink masculinity from domination and violence, and femininity from subordination and obedience. Stop violence against women, girls, and LGBTQ communities. Change social priorities so that activities stereotypically associated with women are valued. Teach that caring and nonviolence are essential in men, women, and social policy. Bring gender-balanced education into schools to change mindsets that value one kind of person more than others. Support partnership education as foundational to ending sexism, racism, and other dominatorisms. Recognize gender equity as key to building a more peaceful, just, and caring world. Promote women in decision-making and bring partnership-oriented women and men from diverse racial and ethnic groups into policy-making positions to support more caring, empathic, and effective policies, including family planning and reproductive choice. Then you go into economics and narratives and language. Why don't you tell us what we need to do there?
Well, as you know, my book, The Real Wealth of Nations, really proposes that we have to move beyond both capitalist and socialist theory, which, I mean, they came out of early industrial times in the 1700s and 1800s, and now we're in the 21st century post-industrial economy. They'd be antiquated on that count alone. But the problem with both these theories, which came out of more rigid domination times, is that both Smith and Marx did not assign real value to the most fundamental human work, caring for people starting in early childhood and caring for our Mother Earth. For them, nature was there to be exploited, period. So I have introduced the concept of a caring economics or partnerism, knowing full well that we have all been conditioned, haven't we, to say caring, I mean, that's soft, that's feminine. Well, studies including our social wealth economic indicators developed by the Center for Partnership Studies show the economic value of this work performed in households, for example, is huge. So it's really a whole new economic thinking, isn't it?
Yes, I've talked to Chomsky a couple times, and he talks about including externalities in our accounting of the costs. And mostly what he's referring to are negative, the cost of pollution and joblessness and things like that. But the other side of it that I've come up with is what you're talking about, because what you're talking about are positive externalities that should be included in the economic balance sheet, like building strong communities, creating healthier mental health-wise people who are less likely to become dependent upon the state or become incarcerated. These are externalities that make for a stronger, more vibrant, healthier culture.
Absolutely. And I like to focus, as you just noted, Rob, on the positives. Because just critiquing, deconstructing, we have to do it. But it's not enough. We have to reconstruct. And my work is really a roadmap, as Archbishop Desmond Tutu and others have said, to a better society, to a better world.
Amen. Yes, indeed. So let's go into the last of these cornerstones, which is narratives and language. Talk about that, where that fits in to changing for a better world.
We've already touched on it, that we really have to re-examine our language. For example, in terms of gender relations, the only words we have in the English language are matriarchy or patriarchy, which are basically two sides of a domination coin, right?
Yes.
There is no partnership alternative. And there has to be, because what we know again and again is, for example, the Scandinavian nations, which, by the way, are not socialists. They have a very healthy market economy. And they're not, it's not that they have caring policies because they're more homogeneous and small. There are plenty of small, homogeneous societies that are very domination-oriented and violent, right? It's because they orient to the partnership side. So language, we need new words, but we also desperately need new stories. And we are bombarded by these stories, starting with human nature, stories. And really nurturing our humanity shows again and again that actually domination systems stand in the way of optimal human development on the most basic levels of realizing our enormous capacities that make us so really human, for consciousness, for caring, for creativity.
I believe so much in what you're saying, and I write about it in my book too, Bottom Up Revolution, that we need people to come up with new stories for movies and for TV shows. We need people that, along the lines you're talking about, we need to show stories where women are strong and powerful and treated equally by men. We need stories where children are given the respect and the love and none of the kinds of punishment, and where people who do the wrong thing are get consequences. I write in my book about how we need to have collective heroes. We need, because every story has a hero's journey, and we need to have it so that we're all the heroes. And too many heroes are men. We need to have a lot more female heroes, and we need to have heroes that are nurturing and supportive. I think those are all the kinds of narrative ideas that I think you would agree with, right?
Absolutely. And really, it's a challenge to creative people of all kinds. And we are all, by the way, potentially creative.
Like Shonda Rhimes and George Lucas and Disney Studios and James Cameron, the people who are making these blockbuster stories, they can do this. They could, by a couple of stories like that, change everything, change the trend, and really turn things around hugely, and perhaps way more powerfully than members of Congress could.
Well, I think that we really need to encourage and support the creativity of the people who have the resources to get these different stories out. So yes, I absolutely agree.
Now, creativity, that is something that you throw into the mix here, that you regularly include as part of the partnership side of things. Where does creativity fit in as with partnership versus domination? I have a feeling it's tied in with flexibility too.
It is. And of course, not so long ago, a real man could not be an artist, right? Because that was effeminate. I mean, think about that for a minute.
True.
No, creativity, I mean, and by that I mean real creativity, not just creating more and more propaganda for consuming, accumulating, which is a substitute for what humans so want and need, caring connection, by the way, which is so difficult to obtain in domination systems. These are the things that we really have to start paying attention. But I think for our creativity to really be able to flow, we have to really shift more to partnership, because it is through our mistakes that are not punished as they are, in domination systems, and sometimes very severely, that we become creative, that we learn, that we experiment. So, yes, creativity. I would love to see, and I do see how creative children are who are brought up in more partnership ways.
Okay, and for one of the shows, we've got to kind of cut it here. Let me pause. And my guest for this show has been Riane Eisler. She's the author of the new book, Nurturing Our Humanity, How Domination and Partnership Shape Our Brains, Lives, and Future. Her website is rianeeisler.com. Thanks so much for being on the show.
It's a pleasure to be with you on the show, and I'd love to talk with you.
Okay, 10-second pause, and then we go back for the final step. All right, so now we've got about 5 more minutes that I'll weave into the show. And I really love what you talk about. Well, I love the way you bring in the evolution of love. And I'm fascinated by your discussion of war. So let's finish up this conversation by talking about war and love.
Well, the data that we now have, archaeological data, anthropological data, and it really is very, very strong, showing that actually war is really something that comes in with domination systems. And that for millennia, there was no such thing as war. But it isn't only war, it's levels of violence. Because we have in our world a pandemic of violence against women and children, what I call intimate violence. And this is where children first experience and first observe that it's okay, they're told even moral, to use violence to impose your will on others. So there is a direct link between that so often marginalized pandemic of violence against women and children, all the way from genital mutilation to, horrors, absolute horrors. I don't just talk about spanking here. And warfare. Violence is learned. We are capable of it, but whether we use it on a routine basis in our families is directly related to whether a culture is more warlike and peaceful.
And you literally refer to studies of locations where there have been massacres, going back thousands of years. Our understanding of mass violence has really emerged in recent years. You get into the details of that.
Well, I get into the details, and my co-author, Douglas Fry, is really an expert in that area. And I think that it's very, very important for us to understand that this is not inevitable. It is not part of, quote, human nature. Starting with that, we then have to look at what Nurturing Our Humanity looks at. What kind of social system, what kind of social configuration do we need to build? And what are these four cornerstones of childhood? Gender, economics, and language and stories, so that we have foundations for a society in which war is no longer just the way things are.
Okay, now give me a couple minutes on love.
Well, love has been so devalued. And I am always amazed by the fact that there's so little science on love. It's now beginning to emerge because we've been moving in the last few centuries, challenging traditions of domination, and moving more to the partnership side. And what we need to understand about love is that what really wise people have told us for millennia is true, that love is fundamental to not only human happiness, but actually to human survival. We survive and we thrive because of love. And that's something brought out in a new approach to evolution that's introduced in Nurturing Our Humanity.
Yes, and we've really got to wrap. This is a wonderful book, Nurturing Our Humanity by Riane Eisler and Douglas Fry. You have outdone yourself. You've taken your model that you presented in Chalice and the Blade, and it's blossomed into a forest of beautiful foliage and blooms that give us a vision of how people could be. That is just extraordinary. And I just hope that you can get the word out about it and that we can start seeing what you've envisioned become reality, because it's such a powerful one. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.